Bobby Anderson is the supervisor for the Exhibits and Displays section of the U.S. Botanic Gardens horticulture team. He has an extensive background in production horticulture, horticultural displays, and greenhouse facility operations. Before joining the garden, Bobby was production manager at Healthy Flavors, a culinary herb farm and greenhouse, where he supervised employees, managed the facilities, and worked on strategic planning. Before that, he was systems manager at Holistic Industries and served as senior horticulturist at the National Aquarium in Baltimore. Bobby has a bachelor's degree in biology from Longwood University and a master's degree in applied science with a minor in entomology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Bobby's joining us today from the USBG production facility. In Southwest Washington, D.C., the PF is 85,000 square feet under glass, divided into 34 greenhouse bays and 17 environmental zones. It's not generally open to the public, so we're excited to share a peek at the location where our poinsettias are grown and cared for prior to making their way to the conservatory for display. So with that, welcome, Bobby.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Libby.
We're excited to chat with you today. Before we get into finer points about growing and caring for poinsettias, can you share a bit about this year's display up at the conservatory?
Sure. I believe there's an image up there. Yep, there it is. And so you'll see those very large poinsettias. Those are some of our heirloom poinsettias. We keep them year to year. A lot of these poinsettias are older cultivars that you can no longer get in the trade. And they are some of the first hybrids from the original poinsettia breeding. Poinsettias in the wild are actually like a large shrubby tree. And so the first breeding done with them resulted in kind of a leggy, smaller bract poinsettia. The Eckie varieties are within that. And then future breeding has been done to where you have the poinsettia you would find at a local garden store or hardware store. And so these large varieties do get quite large. We're a little worried about the ones we grew this year, that they were going to stretch too much to where we couldn't even get them out of the greenhouse. They did stop perfectly at the right height, and we were able to get them out and installed. And so we wanted to highlight those older varieties and really show a poinsettia that most people hadn't seen before, and especially in that shape and structure. And below those, we had kind of a sea of red of different colors and different textures of red that we wanted to show a variety of different cultivars and straight ups and pinched varieties.
So how many different types of poinsettias does the USBG have within its collection or on display?
We did about 23 different varieties this year. It starts at about 2,500 plugs or so, and it gives us about 1,000 pots. And so some of those pots have a single plant in them, and some have 3 per pot. It's like our hanging baskets have probably about 18 plugs in one hanging basket to get that really nice full size and shape. So you'll see the hanging baskets in the back there. The ones right up front are actually it's a 3 per pot, and those plants are pinched a few weeks after they are plugged into those pots, and that pinching really promotes branching. And so you get a very nice, full, displayable plant.
So you're talking about pinching them to make them fuller. So there's also like a single-stemmed option. Is that correct?
Yeah, so we did do a set of straight ups. And so straight ups, you actually do the opposite. So straight up is on the left there, where you have the pinched varieties on the right. And so a pinch variety, you take the very top leader, and you promote those side branching. On a straight up, you're actually pinching all those side branches off and just promoting that one central leader. A straight up does result in larger bracts, which are very showy. The problem with a straight up is if that top gets damaged, the entire plant is done, where the pinched varieties, we get a little bit more longevity out of them. They can lose a head or two, and it's not that big of a deal. It still looks pretty good. So a little bit of different growing technique in terms of labor. And so the pinch varieties, you basically a couple weeks in, we generally pinch the first week of September. Those plants are plugged like the first or second week of August. And so you pinch them, and that's about it. You pinch at an even level throughout the greenhouse, and so everything kind of branches out to the same size. The straight ups, though, is kind of consistently pinching those side branches off until those bracts really start to color up. And so they do take a little bit more work to produce, but you do get that really amazing large bract.
So you're saying pinch for both the branched ones and then also the single stems. Can you explain what the difference would be? So like you're fully removing the branches on the single stem. What are you doing with the multiple stemmed ones? What's the difference in how you're managing?
So the multi-stem ones, you're basically just taking that top leader, and you're doing that in one kind of get-go. And so you pinch the entire room at the same time. You try to pinch them as evenly as possible, and so you have a really consistent pinch throughout the house, and that leads to more consistent branching and more kind of consistent, identical a crop.
Awesome. So you mentioned that you started pinching in September. What's the garden's timeline for sort of getting the poinsettias in and carrying and getting them ready to go up to the conservatory?
So it actually starts in January and February. And so January, we're kind of coming up with the design for the next year's show. In February, we're selecting varieties and purchasing those plugs, or at least ordering them. The plugs don't really come until the end of July, early August. And at that point, we'll pot them up, whether it's 3 per pot or a single stem plant. They'll go into the greenhouses. We keep the shade covering them because they're kind of vulnerable. We don't want to induce too much transplant shock at that point in time. As they start to get over that transplant shock, we start opening the shades, we start fertilizing them, and then that first week of September really works for us to do that large-scale pinch to get that really nice, full, nicely branched poinsettia by Thanksgiving. And so in a traditional poinsettia greenhouse, you would generally see blackout curtains, and you kind of can see a sidewall here, up here behind me. So that would essentially, you would lower that on the walls and on the ceiling, and you're basically blocking all the light from the exterior into the house. It's a way of controlling the photo period. And so traditionally, growing poinsettias, you would use blackout curtains to have those poinsettias color up right when you wanted them to. So as soon as you change that photo period to a 12-hour dark cycle, they're going to start coloring up. And so if you took one of these poinsettias and you threw them under 20 hours of light, they would start greening back up. They would start reverting back to vegetative growth. We don't actually need to use blackout curtains here. We've been successful without using them for several years, and that's because our deadline for the poinsettia crop is basically Thanksgiving at the opening of our holiday show. And we have found that with the natural light cycles in this area, we can not use blackout, just let the poinsettias do their thing under normal photo period, and they color up and finish when we need them to. Some varieties don't, and so we just don't use those varieties, and there are plenty of other cultivars that we can select from to get what we need. And that comes from trialing and grabbing the new varieties every year and doing a few of them, seeing how they work, seeing how they react to our environment.
Do we have new ones for this year?
Yeah, we have several new ones. This is probably one of my favorite.
Oh my gosh, that's amazing.
Winter Rose Dark Red. This is done as a straight up. And so that's a single stem with this really unique head. And so that same plant is right here, done as a pinched 3 per pot variety. And it is very beautiful, but it's also not the fullest plant. It's got a lot of airspace in it. And so it doesn't really work for our needs. But these straight ups are super unique, and you will probably see some of these in the holiday display next year.
Very, very fun. So you mentioned, our timeline and sort of what we need to do, and that we don't use blackout. But do you use a particular type of growing media for the poinsettias that might be different than you would use for other crop plants?
Yes. So traditionally, we've used a peat-based substrate. However, we are trying to reduce the amount of peat we use And so we have been trialing other substrates. Last year, we did a large trial in 100% cocoa fiber, and that's the media you see on the far right. And that is a byproduct from the coconut industry. On the far left is our traditional peat-based mix that we've used in past years. And so this year we actually combine the two. And so that's what's in the middle. And it's a blend of that peat-based substrate and that cocoa core. It's about 60% peat-based substrate, 40% cocoa core. And then we added in trichoderma, which is green mold. It's a beneficial fungus. It helps prevent root rot. And then we also added kelp meal to give a little bit of food in the beginning, but then also lots of micronutrients.
And are you happy with the current combination, or are you going to keep like tweaking with it and playing with it as you go through this year into next season?
It worked great. We do long-term want to reduce our peat usage, and so we'll probably play with it and we'll trial some other things. We're looking at forest-based products to kind of substitute for those peats. But it worked really well. And so it'll be small trials here and there going forward. And we will use the same substrate next year for the majority of the crop until we find a better alternative.
Awesome. So we've had a couple questions about propagation and rebloom. So first, can you get poinsettias to rebloom each year, and what might be the best strategy for that?
So yeah. If you just continue to grow the poinsettia that you bought throughout the winter, you want to keep them above 50, 55 degrees. They get damaged if you drop them below that. Keep them watered, but let them dry out in between waterings. And if you want them to start growing vegetatively immediately, you can throw it under a light 18, 20 hours a day, and they'll start to regrow vegetatively. You can also just wait for that naturally to happen with the change in seasons. And they'll start to turn green again in the spring and grow throughout the summer. And then when the days shorten in the fall, they will then start to color back up.
Awesome. Can they be propagated from cuttings?
For sure. So we do a lot of our heirlooms from cuttings every year, and it's a good way to hold them over. If we don't necessarily want such a big plant, we can take some cuttings. We will generally re-veg them before we take cuttings, and so we have a couple areas in this facility that we have grow lights, and so we'll take some of those plants, put them under grow lights with a long day period, short night period, and they will start to turn green and start growing vegetatively again. At that point, we will take cuttings from them, root them generally in perlite in a high humidity area. And once they have the good roots on them, we'll pot them up in the traditional media we've been using and put them back into a greenhouse to continue to grow throughout the season.
So if someone has a poinsettia in a location that gets light like 24 hours a day, it's in like a hallway or a lobby or something, will it turn green sooner?
Yes, but it also depends on the intensity of the light. If they're just in like a hallway with overhead fluorescence, they may start turning green again. But if you're really looking for them to turn green immediately, you're going to have a more intense grow light usually to give them that good photo period with adequate amount of light.
Gotcha. Here's a fun question. Do poinsettias come in any colors other than white, pink, or red?
Yes, they do. And so we have a lovely yellow one here. We also grew a lot of speckled and marbled varieties this year. There are also, it's so color and texture are two of the things they really play with in breeding. Hardiness of the plant, those kinds of things happen as well. But color is probably the more important one. So yeah, there's some of our speckled varieties. And so quick Google search of poinsettias and looking for some of the companies that produce these will generally every winter show off the new varieties that they bred the previous years. And if any new varieties come on the market, we tend to grab a few of them just to trial them in our own facility. Sometimes they work out great, and sometimes we're like, nah, we'll let someone else try those. Yeah, it's pretty incredible. It's funny. I had never grown poinsettias until I came to the garden, and I never really got the appeal. And then I grew my first crop, really watched that color change happen, and I was like, "This is awesome!" And I was totally hooked.
and the color change that happens, That's on a bract, correct? That's not the flowers of the plant?
Correct. So the really showy part is a modified leaf called a bract. The flowers are very small in Euphorbiaceae, and so you can kind of see them in the center of that. Yeah, there you go. And so that yellow and those red stems are the actual flower pieces, and those red bracts around them are actually a modified leaf, and those red bracts are really a way of attracting pollinators into those smaller, less attractive flowers.
So do you know what pollinates a poinsettia then?
In the wild?
Yeah.
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's okay. Just wondering. Yeah. What sort of pests do you guys encounter when you're dealing with growing poinsettias at the garden?
Whitefly and root rot are two of our big ones. And we actually had really good success with that trichoderma in our growing media this year. Normally in a large production setting, losing 5-10% of the plants to root rot is it happens. This year it was, minuscule. Just a couple of them. And that trichoderma we use as a beneficial product. And so beneficial insects, there are beneficial fungi, beneficial bacteria. And so we're adding that beneficial fungus into that soil mix. And so it's there from the get-go as the plants root in. They have an interaction and they're basically maintaining territory. And so that good fungus is in there maintaining territory. It prevents those root rot funguses from coming in and causing issues for us.
So if you're thinking about root rot, someone asked a question about how moist the soil should be in the pot. Like, what is it best to water with warm water? Like, what sort of tips would you have there to sort of prevent that?
I generally always recommend watering with room temperature water, especially in a home setting. Too warm of water will cause damage, and then you get rot. Too cold of water can also potentially cause damage or stunting of the plant. And so room temperature water is generally your best way to move forward. And poinsettias like to dry down. They don't want wet roots. And so water deeply when you do water. And so water until water is coming out the bottom of the pot and really flowing through and really actively drinking. But then letting that plant dry down before you water again is really beneficial to those roots. And you generally don't want them to wilt, but like the first signs of wilt, if you want to water at that point, that would be great. But we pick them up. And so like when you pick up a plant, you can really tell the difference between a plant that has wet roots and one that has fairly dry roots. And so when we're determining what we're going to water, a lot of times it's like you walk through, you pick up a handful of plants on a bench and kind of get an idea of where the bench is at in terms of moisture levels within those pots. And then you can make a determination on when your next watering is going to be.
I mean, with the volume of plants that we maintain for the show, like how long does that watering take?
It does take a while. We do have a pretty extensive drip system in here, but because of all the varieties we grow, there are lots of individual drip systems, and so you have to move a hose from one to the other. But so you connect a hose to an individual system, it'll water an entire bench or half a bench generally, depending on how they're split up. And so like with drip systems, I tend to water in a series of 3. And so you come in, you hook up your hose, you let water run until you see dripping out of the bottom of the majority of the pots on the bench. Unplug your hose line, go water some other stuff, and then come back, plug it in, let it run again until you see water coming out the bottom. And then you come back for a third time. And so drip systems, your water is just going in a small point, and we generally have 2 drip stakes per pot. It helps if one somehow gets clogged, you have a secondary one that's not going to just have your plant dry out entirely. But because those drip stakes are pretty precise in where that water's going, that sessioned watering really allows that water to expand throughout the media and move throughout the entirety of the pot. And so you get a really full deep watering in the pot through drip irrigation.
So that makes me wonder if poinsettias can be grown hydroponically.
They can be. So we have some hydroponic poinsettias in the hydroponic exhibit in South Transition at the conservatory. They did not super like it. It definitely took them time to really start rooting in, but it is possible. I don't know if I would ever want to do a large-scale crop of hydroponic poinsettias, but it is possible. There is that. So we grow in soilless media. So we grow in soilless media and we liquid feed. You could argue that the way we grow is technically hydroponics to some extent, but it is not like roots directly in water. So the display uptown at the conservatory is roots directly in water, but yeah, it's not something I would want to do on scale.
Good to know. Good to know for sure. Here, someone had a question about cross-pollinating. So could they cross-pollinate at home and grow from seed?
You could. Couldn't tell you what's going to come out of those seeds, but it's worth a shot. Generally, in traditional breeding, it takes about 7 years to get a trait into a crop. And so companies that are breeding poinsettias are doing this long term. I mean, they're constantly making crosses and growing out plants. And it's like if you took 1,000 seeds and you grew them out, you may pick a couple that had characteristics that you were looking for, and then continue to work with those couple. And so it's a big process. So you're welcome to do it at home, but I couldn't tell you what's going to come of it.
So another light question. So what are the best light conditions during the year, and should it change or stay the same, like depending on your timeline and your growing cycle?
So poinsettias do like light. We will actually shade them in the early part of the season, and that's mostly to reduce temperature. And so poinsettias don't really like to be above 80, 85 degrees. They get stressed, and stressed plants are generally more susceptible to disease and insect pressures. And so we'll close that shade cloth when the temperatures in the greenhouse get too high, just to help alleviate some of that stress. But yeah, they love sun. They would totally take full sun at 80 degrees all day long. But if you're really looking for them to then color up, you would reduce that photo period to a long night, which about 12 hours of darkness.
Oh, wow. Okay. Someone's asking, they see lots of pots with multiple plants being grown together. And I think you mentioned that as part of the display during the intro. Can poinsettias grow close together, or should they be separated? Like, how do you make that determination?
So the majority of our crop is actually multiple plants in a single pot. And we grow the majority of our plants in an 8-inch pot, and it's generally 3 plugs per pot. And that leaves us a very full displayable plant, or set of plants. And so we'll pot up 3 per pot. A couple weeks in, first week of September for us, we'll pinch the tops all to level height, and then let them grow on from there. And they kind of grow around each other. And you can do that long term. It depends on what your goals are, really. We like poinsettias that have lots of flowering heads that we don't have to change out all the times if a flowering head is broken off here or there. And so that really works for us, but it depends on what your own goals are.
That makes sense. We had a question about the growing medium that you're talking about, and this person was wondering if you ever used leca.
Yeah, so lightweight expanded clay aggregate is leca. I don't use a ton of it here. It's just we have other medias that we prefer. I have used it in the past, especially in hydroponic systems, and it can be used well. It's just not something I use a ton of.
And can you find poinsettia growing medium at like a nursery or local nursery or somewhere?
Yeah, and really any standard soilless media you find at a growing center should work fine for you. I'm sure you could use like dirt out of your backyard. It would just really depend on how much you watered and things like that. You may not be successful the first year or so, but you could give it a shot. But a standard like soilless media you find at a local nursery center or hydroponic store, any of those kinds of things should work fine.
Awesome. Question for you about sap. Some people find it irritating. Do you have any suggestions when you're working with your poinsettia to sort of avoid that, or like, yeah?
Don't get it in your eyes. It's quite painful. Gloves are always a good thing. when working with plants. Protecting your hands is very important. And washing your hands before touching your eyes or anything else before you're moving on from that task. So yeah, don't get it in your eyes though. You'll remember that for a long time.
And I know sometimes people say like, don't let your pets around them, or like it's harmful if you ingest them. What is that? Is that necessarily a true statement, or what are your thoughts on that?
Definitely come home to my cat nibbling my poinsettia at home. And she's totally fine. You have to eat a large quantity of it for it to have really any detrimental effects. And I'm sure that you would get really tired of eating it before it caused any harmful effects. I'd also recommend not eating plants that are not traditionally edible, and keeping plants that you're worried and concerned about your plants eating in areas that they don't have access to.
Smart. Yeah. I have another question here about light levels. So how much light can poinsettias take during the dark period? This person has a window that's like a quarter mile from a bridge with lights on, and is that too bright?
It's hard to say. It's probably not going to affect it very much. And a little bit light here or there is probably totally fine for the average user. If you're growing commercially for profit, you probably want to minimize that type of stuff as much as possible. We definitely have some like street lights around our facility and things like that. And some light does come in at night, and we haven't really seen it affecting our crop.
What about humidity levels or temperature levels within a home setting? Like, are there any particular things that people should think about when growing poinsettias in their house relative to those items, humidity or temperature?
So temperature, you want to keep above 55 and below 80, 88. Most people's homes are kept at temperatures that poinsettia is going to be totally happy at. Humidity, same thing. We don't do a whole lot in terms of humidity control within our greenhouse. So average home conditions is generally perfectly fine to grow a poinsettia well.
What about outdoors? Are there particular zones that would be better or worse for growing poinsettias if you wanted to do them outside?
You don't. So again, you don't want them outside if it's going to get below 50, 55. And then during your summer months, especially in areas that get well into the 90s and things like that, they'll probably take up more water and be a little stressed, but it is possible. Ideally, you're going to have that kind of middle range in the 70 to 80 degrees, and they'll be perfectly happy at that. But I mean, it's growing is trial and error. And so if you want to give it a shot outside, I say give it a shot, see what happens.
This person here is using a peat cocoa coir mix. Do you think they can grow their poinsettias using that sort of substrate?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. So the plants we grew in 100% cocoa, they grew fine. The bract density just wasn't there. And so they grew really nice plants, but they weren't as full as we wanted them. And so that blend of that peat cocoa really gave us really nice number of bracts, which gave a really nice full plant.
Has the USBG created any poinsettia varieties? And how do people do that in the industry?
I believe there was some breeding done at one point in time. And we may have some of these varieties over here. I'd have to double check, to be perfectly honest. But same way you breed most flowering plants is you take pollen and you introduce it to the pistils of the plant. And eventually you may get seed production and seed forming. We've definitely done it in areas, just us having fun, basically, to see what would happen. And not all of them take for sure. So if you want to try that at home, I would say try the whole thing. Try to get as much pollen on those female reproductive parts as you can, and see how many seeds you get from that.
So you mentioned sort of trial and error. Are there any interesting things you've tried and maybe erred at that we can all learn from?
Yeah, so like the heirloom varieties, allowing them to get as large as we did was something very new. We have a very beautiful Eckie pink variety in the middle of one of our fountains in the garden court at the conservatory. It is, I don't know, it's enormous. It was way up over my head. We were really concerned about getting it out and up there safely, and we were able to do so. It's kind of a really neat thing for us because we'll probably do more of that in future years. Just very big, large, beautiful poinsettias. The straight up trials we did this year was really cool. That the rose is I've never seen this. This is super cool. Like
I love
that,
that.
it was,
That's so awesome.
yeah, it was a lot of fun watching it happen too. And you never know how some of these things are going to turn out until you try them. So let's say give it a shot.
Do you have a favorite poinsettia?
I don't know. It's hard. I like them all. I do really
I like
like
asking about your favorite kid or your favorite pet. Yeah.
yeah. I like how large the bracts get in the straight ups. It's really incredible to see a bract that's the size of your face. It's not what you're going to find at like your local garden store or your box store. And so that's a lot of fun. And seeing how large these heirlooms got was pretty incredible.
So does the size of the pot impact the size of the plants? Because I know that there are some like really small varieties and some much larger ones. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And with hydroponics, you can kind of force things to do what you want on. And so like you can grow a very large plant in a very small pot hydroponically. But yeah, there's generally a relationship between the pot size and ultimately what's happening above the soil or substrate. And so we found with an 8-inch pot with 3 plants gives us a very nice size poinsettia for our needs. We do some in 6-inch pots, and it's like the straight up I was showing you is in a 6-inch pot, and you got a fairly large plant in a 6-inch pot. And so we are curious if we bump that up to an 8, how tall we could actually get that plant. And so that's maybe something we trial next year.
How tall do they get in the wild? Like when they're just given free reign and doing their thing?
I've never seen them in the wild, but I have seen poinsettias grow outside in the ground in areas that don't get super cold. And they were, I don't know, 15, 20 feet tall.
Wow.
So they are small trees in the wild. It's pretty incredible to see. It's like you're so used to that little poinsettia, and then you walk up and you're like, oh my gosh, that is a poinsettia, is it not?
That's amazing. That's so big. Wow. We have a question here. Do you have to repot poinsettias if you're keeping them from year to year and change out the growing media?
It depends on what you're growing in. Repotting is generally a good idea. Substrates do break down over time. They get compacted. It causes a variety of problems. One is roots dying off and rotting. And so pulling them out of those pots, freshening up the roots and the soil media will definitely help. You could probably get by a year or two with the same pot, same media. But long term, if say you want to keep a variety for the next 10 years, repotting it on a regular cycle would be beneficial.
Are there any other euphorbs that do well in DC outdoors?
Yeah, for sure. I don't have a particular list on me right now, but yeah, there are definitely euphorbias that you can walk around DC and see growing out of tree boxes and things like that, for sure.
So how do you guys go about designing the display at the conservatory? Like what's the thought process there? Who organizes it?
And it's some of it is going other places and getting inspiration from other gardens and seeing what they've done, and then figuring out how that we can kind of make that our own. So like the color scheme this year is fairly traditional, a lot of red, and so it depends on how people are feeling or what we've been requested to do, and so we. The goal is to always make it better and add some new stuff. And so like those heirlooms this year were a very big new thing this year. Sometimes we'll do like painted trees or something like that, like silver painted trees. And to get that height. And those things can be very aesthetic and beautiful, but having these very large, attractive poinsettias is very good horticulture, in my opinion. And so we really want to focus on horticulture and really producing the best horticulture displays that we can. And so being able to use a plant versus, say, a hardscape material is part of that.
Wow. I mean, they're so impressive. When do you start next year's design and process?
So we're already thinking about it. I've gone to a couple gardens the past couple weeks and just seen what they've been doing, and seen some really cool, unique things and some stuff that I want to try here, but I know it's going to take a few years before we get it done well. So we're always thinking about it. We tend to get stuff down on paper at the end of the year, early January, and that allows us to put our order together for plugs in February to have them make sure they show up when we need them in late July, early August.
Yeah. So what do you think about when you're combining other plants with the poinsettias in the display? And, what other types of plants do you think look good with them?
I like color contrast, texture contrast. It's a variety of different things we look at. Sometimes it's just what we have that looks great on hand. In the case of crop failures, things don't always turn out well, especially with trialing things or disease problems and pest issues. And so sometimes it's like, well, that failed. What else do we have that looks great on hand? And we make it work. Some things like the ferns we tend to order in versus producing ourselves. It for the plant and the time and everything and the cost, it tends to make more sense to buy some stuff in, but we do try to grow as much as we can for our displays.
Wonderful. So there's a variety at the conservatory called Christmas Mouse, which is super fun. Can you talk a little bit about those?
So it's been bred to have a very rounded leaf. And so the leaf shape is just very unique compared to a lot of plants. And so you can see a couple, popping in there below the white one. And you can see the difference in that shape. And it just offers a really unique texture and variety compared to some of the other plants. And so the plants we have underneath of the heirlooms within the display are all more or less red, but the leaf is different shaped or different textured, or we did some straight ups, and so you got very large bracts. And so it was this kind of sea of red with variety of textures and shapes.
Very fun. Do we ever work with other botanic gardens or exchange plants with other gardens relative to poinsettias?
I don't know if we've traded a whole lot of poinsettias, but there are certain varieties of plants, not just poinsettias, that are not really available on the market anymore. And so if it's a variety we're interested in growing, we'll reach out to other gardens at times and see if anybody has those things. And plant people tend to like to share, and a lot of these plants are fairly easily propagatable, and so it's not a big ask to take a cutting here or there.
When you're done with the poinsettias at the production facility, what happens to that space? Because you talked about they just grow from July or August to December, essentially, and that feels like it's a large room. What happens there?
And so we're in Zone 11. Zone 11 is 3 bays. It is one of our large production houses. So in between crops, it's good to clean deeply and solarize. And so we'll pull everything out of the room, plant-wise. Give it a very good deep scrub. And then especially in the summer, we allow the temperature go up to about 110. And it just helps kill off any bacteria, fungus, any insects that are kind of hanging out in the zone. And so we'll do that right before the poinsettias come in, and then we'll do it after the poinsettias come out. And then spring, basically from like February until late May, early June, it's a annual production house for our Gardens and Grounds team.
Awesome. We did have one more question. If you could repeat when the dark period should begin when you're working with poinsettias.
Honestly, whenever you want them to color up and bloom. So you can take a fresh plug, which is a tiny little rooted cutting, and you can throw it straight into a 12-hour dark cycle, and it will make a tiny little colored up poinsettia. And so it depends on like what your final product is. If you're looking for a bunch of tiny little plants, you can start pretty much immediately. If you're looking for very large plants, so the large heirloom I was talking about that's in the fountain at the garden court, that plant's a couple years old. And we actually re-vegged it, pruned it in certain ways to get the branching structure that we wanted, and then allowed it to recolor up just naturally with our photo period before we put it on display. But so it depends on what your goals are.
That makes total sense. So how do you work together with your team to sort of create the display and manage the poinsettia care?
So it is one of our largest crops, and so it's kind of all hands on deck when the plugs come in. There is a point person for this crop, and he helps to organize and make sure all the drip lines are set and prepped and things are clean. And he actually mixed all of the soil we used pretty much by hand this year. So it was a very awesome effort on his part. And then plugs come in. They generally sit in a greenhouse overnight, and then everybody comes together as a team. We get all the plants plugged. We want them all plugged in a very small window. It's generally a day or two, and that means everything's kind of on the same timeline. So if you did some and then waited a week or two, those plants would be a little bit behind those earlier plants. And so our baskets, some years we do have those plugs come in early to make a very large basket. We didn't end up doing that this year, but we will have them come in 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time of our main crop to get that extra growth.
Oh, wow. Okay. Very fun. Well, Bobby, I just want to thank you so much for spending some time with us today and sharing a little peek at the production facility and your wonderful expertise about our poinsettias. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're totally welcome. It was nice talking to you all today. I hope you enjoyed it.